Imagine a time when humanity was just beginning to master the art of turning earth and stone into permanent homes. Across the ancient world, stone was no longer only a tool for survival, it became a symbol of memory, of endurance, of eternity. Most often, this mastery of stone was dedicated not to the living, but to the ancestors. Megaliths were raised as eternal houses for the dead, powerful monuments meant to stand forever against time and wind. And yet, in a few extraordinary places, this tradition was turned inward. Stone was used not only to honor the spirits, but to create entire living worlds for communities themselves. Villages built to last, where generations could grow, work, and dream. To find the most breathtaking example of this, we travel far north, to the wild and windswept archipelago off the coast of Scotland. Here, in the Orkney Islands, Neolithic culture did not merely survive, it flourished. So advanced were its people and their monuments that archaeologists sometimes call this land the capital of Neolithic Britain. On the edge of the restless Atlantic Ocean, sheltered in a sandy bay, lies one of the most perfectly preserved prehistoric villages in all of Europe, a place sometimes described as a Stone Age Pompeii, the settlement of Skara Brae. The story of Skara Brae's discovery is almost as dramatic as the site itself. For thousands of years it lay hidden, protected beneath a massive dune of sand and turf. Locals called it Skara Brae, the mound by the shore. But in the winter of 1850, a ferocious storm struck the islands. With hurricane winds and mountainous waves, the sea tore at the coast. When the storm finally passed, villagers found that the wind had stripped away the turf, exposing the ghostly stone outlines of ancient houses beneath. What slowly emerged in the decades that followed was not just a cluster of huts, but an entire intact village, preserved for nearly 5 millennia. Dating back to around 3100 BC, Skara Brae is a masterpiece of Neolithic engineering and adaptation. The Orkney Islands were always nearly treeless, so the inhabitants had to build with what nature offered them in abundance: stone. Using flagstone from the coastline, combined with turf and midden, they created dwellings unlike any in Europe. The houses were sunk deep into the ground for warmth and stability, and linked not by open streets, but by low, narrow, stone-lined passageways roofed with slabs. The entire village formed a connected, sheltered maze, a world where people could move between homes protected from the endless wind and rain outside. And it is when you step inside one of these houses that the true magic of Skara Brae is revealed. Step through the low, tunnel-like entrance of a Skara Brae house. You bend your head, feeling the cool stone around you, and then emerge into a single, large, square room. At its very center, a hearth glows faintly, the heart of the home, providing warmth, light, and a place for cooking. The fire crackles softly, filling the room with shifting shadows. Surrounding this fire, you begin to notice the remarkable details of daily life. Against the far wall stands a great stone structure with shelves, almost like a dresser. It is not difficult to imagine it holding the family's most treasured objects: a decorated pot, a polished bone tool, or a string of beads. These displays were not only practical, they were statements of identity, of pride, of belonging. Along the side walls are the beds, large box-like enclosures built entirely from stone slabs. They would have been lined with soft heather, bracken, and animal skins, transformed into warm, protective sleeping spaces. Curiously, the bed on the right was always a little larger than the one on the left. We do not know why. Perhaps it was reserved for elders, or perhaps it carried symbolic meaning lost to us over time. In some houses, archaeologists have found small stone tanks set into the floor near the entrance. These may have been used to keep shellfish alive in salt water before mealtime. A clever adaptation to life by the sea. Beneath the entire village, a system of stone drains carried waste away, showing a surprisingly sophisticated concern for hygiene. Imagine the rhythm of life here. A family gathered around the fire, children laughing, someone repairing a net or shaping bone into a tool, someone else stirring food over the flames. Outside, the Atlantic wind howls, but here, within stone walls, there is warmth, light, and a sense of belonging. The people of Skara Brae were both farmers and foragers. They raised cattle and sheep, and they grew barley in small stone-walled fields. Yet the sea was equally important. Their rubbish heaps tell us they ate large amounts of fish, crabs, shellfish, and seals. They hunted seabirds from the cliffs and collected their eggs. Life was a delicate balance between the land. What is most striking is the sense of equality in this community. Unlike later societies where chiefs and elites ruled, here every house was built on the same plan, with the same stone furniture. No one home dominates another. It was a society of balance, of shared survival, where each family was part of a larger whole. The spiritual world of Skara Brae was never far away. Carved symbols, spirals, chevrons, mysterious lines have been found here, the same pattern seen in the great tombs nearby. This suggests a deep link between the world of the living and the realm of the ancestors. For the people of Skara Brae, life was not separate from death. The two worlds existed side by side, as close as the fire and the shadows on the walls. For 6 centuries, this village endured. Families lived and died here. Children were born and grew within these walls. Harvests were planted and reaped. Storms battered the coast, and still the fires burned. Eventually, the village was abandoned. Not suddenly, but gradually, as drifting sand and changing climate made life here harder. Little by little, the people moved on, leaving behind their stone homes to be covered by time, until a storm, thousands of years later, uncovered them once again. Skara Brae is more than just ruins. It is a time capsule, a whisper from 5,000 years ago, showing us that even in the harshest landscapes, people found ways to build warmth, community, and meaning from stone. From the windswept Orkney Islands, we follow the trail of the megalith builders south, across Britain, until we reach a broad chalk plateau in southern England. This is Salisbury Plain, a landscape that would become home to one of the most iconic monuments of the ancient world, Stonehenge. Stonehenge is not just a single monument, but the product of centuries of change. Its story stretches across at least 1,500 years, with each generation adding something new, reshaping the circle, leaving behind a physical record of shifting beliefs and ambitions. The first stage of Stonehenge, around 3000 BC, was not stone at all. It began as an enormous earthwork, a deep circular ditch with an inner bank, 110 meters across. Just inside this bank, archaeologists discovered a ring of 56 deep holes, now called the Aubrey holes. These may once have held great wooden posts, forming a massive timber circle. This early Stonehenge was also a cemetery. The Aubrey holes and surrounding earth contained the cremated remains of dozens of people, making it one of the largest burial grounds in Britain at the time. Centuries later, around 2600 BC, a radical transformation began. The wooden posts were removed and the people decided to rebuild, this time in stone. But they did not choose just any stone. They sought out a very particular kind, a bluish rock known today as bluestone. These stones were not local. They came from the Preseli Hills of western Wales, more than 150 miles away. Each weighed 2 to 4 tons. Somehow, with sledges and rafts, the builders dragged and floated these immense blocks across rivers, hills, and sea. Why go to such extraordinary lengths? The answer is still debated. Some believe the bluestones carried spiritual power, perhaps healing properties, or perhaps a symbolic link to ancestral homelands far away. Whatever the reason, the effort speaks to a devotion almost beyond our imagination. But the story did not end there. Around 2500 BC, a new phase began, one that gave Stonehenge its iconic form. This time, the builders turned to even larger stones, the massive sarsens, blocks of sandstone weighing up to 40 tons each. These were quarried about 20 miles north and dragged across the plain to the site. Here, the builders achieved feats of astonishing engineering. They shaped and dressed the stones with incredible care, smoothing their surfaces with hammerstones. They carved joints into them, mortise and tenon connections for the uprights and lintels, tongue and groove joins linking the great ring of horizontal stones on top. They even added subtle curves to counter visual distortions, ensuring the stones looked straight and balanced from a distance. Then they raised them. 30 great uprights formed a perfect outer circle, capped by a continuous ring of lintels. Within stood a horseshoe of 5 towering trilithons, 2 uprights supporting a third lintel, some rising over 25 feet into the air. It was an architectural masterpiece. Stonehenge was not crude or primitive. It was sophisticated, intentional, and executed with genius. But what was it for? At its heart, Stonehenge was a temple, but one with many functions. Its alignment with the heavens is its most famous feature. The entire monument is oriented to the rising sun on the summer solstice and the setting sun on the winter solstice. Imagine the community gathering here on the longest day, watching the sun rise directly above the heelstone, or on the shortest day, watching the sun sink into the horizon, framed by stone. Stonehenge was a perpetual calendar, a way of marking the great cycles of nature on which farming life depended. It was also a place of the dead. Around the monument, archaeologists have found the densest concentration of Neolithic and Bronze Age burial mounds in Britain. The contrast was clear. Wooden structures, like the nearby Durrington Wall settlement, were for the living. Stone monuments, heavy and eternal, were for the dead. Some evidence suggests Stonehenge may also have been a place of healing. The bluestones, brought from so far away, were thought to carry special properties. Many of the skeletons buried near Stonehenge show signs of illness or injury. Pilgrims may have traveled great distances to seek cures here, hoping the stones could restore their health. Stonehenge was then many things: a cathedral, a cemetery, a cosmic observatory, and a place of pilgrimage. It was the sacred center of a powerful society, one capable of organizing thousands of people to move mountains of stone and align them with the stars. Even now, its silent stones hold their secrets. But standing among them, you can feel the weight of belief, of ambition, and of the eternal human desire to connect earth, ancestors, and sky. While the people of Britain and the Atlantic coast were raising stone monuments far to the southeast, along the valleys of the Danube and its tributaries, another great experiment in human living was unfolding. Here, in the lands of today's Serbia, Romania, and Bulgaria, the Neolithic blossomed into something astonishing. Dense towns, rich rituals, and the very first steps toward metallurgy. This was the world of the Vinča culture, named after a site near modern Belgrade. From about 5,700 to 4,500 BC, these people created some of the largest and most sophisticated settlements anywhere in Europe at the time. Imagine approaching one of their towns. Unlike the scattered farmsteads of the West, these places could stretch for many hectares. Hundreds of houses stood close together, aligned in careful rows, forming wide avenues. From above, they looked like planned cities, laid out with intention, as though some guiding principle or shared agreement held the community together. The houses were built of wattle and daub, with wooden frames and walls plastered with clay, but they were not simple huts. Some had multiple rooms, ovens for baking bread, platforms for sleeping. Within them, people cooked, stored food, raised children, and created the first glimmers of urban life. The Vinča people left behind an extraordinary legacy of art and symbolism. Thousands of figurines have been found in their towns, stylized human shapes, often female, with elongated necks, triangular faces, and incised decorations. Were they goddesses, ancestors, or representations of everyday life? We cannot be certain, but they suggest a society deeply invested in ritual, in the power of symbols, in the mysteries of life and death. Even more mysterious are the markings found on pottery and tablets, simple lines and signs, repeated with striking regularity. Some scholars believe these may represent one of the earliest forms of writing, a Vinča script, thousands of years older than cuneiform or hieroglyphs. Others argue they were ritual symbols rather than a true language. Either way, they reveal a culture that sought to record, to codify, to give lasting form to its ideas. But perhaps the most revolutionary achievement of the Vinča world was in technology. Here, people began to experiment with a new material, copper. Nuggets of native copper were hammered into beads and small tools. Later, they learned to heat and shape it, taking the first steps toward metallurgy. This was the dawn of a new age, the Chalcolithic or Copper Age, a threshold that would eventually transform human societies forever. And yet, for all their brilliance, the Vinča towns were fragile. Around 4,500 BC, many of them were suddenly abandoned. We do not know why. Perhaps climate shifted. Perhaps new groups migrated into the region. Perhaps social tensions grew too great. Whatever the cause, the great towns of old Europe fell silent. Their houses decayed, their ovens grew cold, their figurines were left behind in the earth. But their legacy endured. The memory of towns, of symbols, of copper lived on, shaping the trajectory of European prehistory. They remind us that the Neolithic was not one story, but many, that alongside the farmers and megalith builders, there were also the urban dreamers of the Balkans, experimenting with forms of life that would echo millennia later in the rise of cities. As Europe's first towns rose and fell far to the east, another story was unfolding, one that would shape the destiny of one of the world's greatest civilizations. In ancient China, The Neolithic Age did not have a single origin, but two, divided by geography and climate. In the north, across the great Yellow River Plain, life was shaped by dry winds and loess soils. Summers were hot, winters bitter, and rainfall was never certain. Here, farming communities learned to cultivate a hardy grain that could withstand these conditions. Millet. Small, resilient, and highly nutritious, millet became the staff of life for the North. Imagine a village along the Yellow River around 6000 BC. Houses of rammed earth rise in clusters, their walls smooth and cool. The floors are dug slightly below the surface, giving warmth in winter and relief in summer. In the center of the village stands a communal storage pit filled with golden millet seeds. Around it, people grind grain on stone querns, preparing flat cakes to be cooked over open fires. These were the people of the Yangshao culture. Their pottery was painted in swirling red and black designs, spirals, fish, geometric patterns. Their villages could number hundreds of houses, laid out in rings with communal spaces at the center. Farming bound them together, but so did ritual. Graves reveal careful burials with grave goods, and figurines show a fascination with fertility and the cycles of life. Far to the south, along the warm, wet valleys of the Yangtze River, a different rhythm of life prevailed. Here, rainfall was abundant, rivers flooded and receded with the seasons, and the land was ideal for water-loving plants. By 5000 BC, communities here had learned to cultivate rice. Picture the scene: low fields flooded with water, where men and women stand ankle-deep in the mud, pressing tiny seedlings into the earth. The sun reflects on the surface, turning the landscape into a mirror of sky and water. Rice demanded more labor than millet, but it rewarded that effort with higher yields. These were the beginnings of the Hemidu culture in the south. Their villages stood on wooden stilts above marshy ground. Their pottery was dark and polished. Their tools included wooden shovels for working wet soil. They raised pigs and dogs, fished with nets, and crafted beautiful ivory ornaments. In their houses, woven mats covered the floors, and the air smelled of drying rice hung in bundles. North and south, millet and rice, earth and water. Two traditions grew side by side, shaping the dual foundations of Chinese civilization. In time, these cultures would interact, exchange, and merge. But even thousands of years later, their legacy remains clear. Northern China would continue to depend on millet and later wheat, while southern China remained the heartland of rice. This agricultural duality shaped diets, economies, and identities for millennia. It also shaped ideas. Farming required cooperation, irrigation channels, storage pits, the sharing of harvests. In the north, this encouraged compact nucleated villages with communal systems. In the south, it inspired careful coordination of water management. Both laid the groundwork for the organized, centralized states that would one day rise in the valleys of the Yellow and Yangtze rivers. So as the people of Europe raised stones and the people of the Balkans worked copper, the people of China were mastering the art of grain and water, creating two different but equally powerful paths into the future. While wheat and barley grew in the Middle East, millet and rice in China, and cattle grazed in Europe, far across the Atlantic, another revolution was taking place. In the ancient landscapes of the Americas, people discovered their own ways to feed communities and shape civilizations. What is striking is that they did so without influence from the old world. Farming here was born independently, a testament to human ingenuity in every corner of the earth. Let us begin in Mesoamerica, the land that today includes Mexico and Central America. Here, by 7000 BC, people had already begun experimenting with the domestication of plants. Slowly, through centuries of observation and patience, they transformed wild grasses into the crop we now know as maize. At first, maize ears were tiny, only a few inches long, with sparse kernels. But generation after generation, farmers selected the strongest and the most nourishing plants. Over time, maize became larger, sweeter, and more reliable. It was a human creation, a plant that could not survive without cultivation, and yet one that would go on to feed millions. But maize alone was not enough. Farmers soon learned to combine it with two other crops, beans and squash. This trio became known as the Three Sisters, a partnership as elegant as it was effective. Maize grew tall, providing a natural pole. Beans twined around the maize stalks, fixing nitrogen into the soil and enriching it. Squash spread low across the ground, its broad leaves shading the soil and locking in moisture. Together, the Three Sisters formed a balanced diet. Maize offered carbohydrates, beans supplied protein, and squash gave vitamins. Together, they allowed communities to grow, settle, and thrive. Imagine a Mesoamerican village, round houses with thatched roofs, smoke rising from cooking fires, the air filled with the scent of roasted maize. Children chase each other through the fields while their parents tend the crops. Each meal is a small miracle of cooperation between plants and people. From these humble beginnings would one day rise the great civilizations of the Maya and Aztecs, with their pyramids, calendars, and cities. But it all began with maize, beans, and squash, three plants that changed the course of history. Now let us journey south, into the highlands of the Andes Mountains, where life was shaped by altitude as much as by soil. Here, the thin air made farming difficult, yet ancient peoples found solutions perfectly adapted to their environment. The most important of their crops was the potato. Hardy, versatile, and rich in nutrients, the potato could thrive in the cold, stony soils of the mountains where few other plants survived. Farmers developed hundreds of varieties, each suited to a particular altitude or climate. They also cultivated quinoa, a protein-rich seed, and maize in the lower valleys. But what truly defined Andean farming was not just what they grew, but how they grew it. To survive in such rugged terrain, they created terraces, great staircases cut into the mountainsides, lined with stone walls, holding precious soil in place. Irrigation canals carried water from melting glaciers to these man-made fields. The site of an Andean valley, green terraces rising step by step into the clouds, is still one of the wonders of human ingenuity. And the Andes gave more than crops. They gave animals, too. People here domesticated the llama and the alpaca, gentle creatures that provided wool, meat, and transport. Herds grazed on the high pastures, their silhouettes moving across the horizon like threads in a vast tapestry of sky and stone. Picture a highland village, small stone houses clustered together, smoke curling into the cold air, fields carved into mountainsides, llamas tethered near the dwellings. Life was hard, but it was stable, and above all, it was sustainable. From these roots, centuries later, would grow the mighty empire of the Inca, whose roads, terraces, and storehouses still leave us in awe. But like Mesoamerica, it all began with plants and patience, potatoes, quinoa, maize, and the steady step of llamas climbing mountain paths. A different path, What unites these American beginnings is not similarity, but diversity. There was no single Neolithic package here. Each region found its own solutions. In the rainforests, people cultivated manioc and sweet potatoes. In the deserts, they built irrigation canals. Across the hemisphere, countless experiments in farming allowed human communities to flourish in landscapes as varied as jungle, desert, and mountain. It is a reminder that agriculture is not one story, but many. Everywhere people looked at their environment, the plants, the animals, the soil, the rivers, and asked the same question: how can we make life endure? And everywhere, the answer was different, yet always ingenious. High in the mountains of New Guinea, far from the great centers of civilization in Asia or Europe, another agricultural story was unfolding. It is a place of thick forests, steep valleys, and heavy rains, where farming could not look like it did on open plains. Yet by around 7000 BC, people here had found their own way to feed themselves, creating one of the earliest known farming systems on Earth. Instead of grains, they turned to root crops, taro, yam, and bananas. These plants thrived in the humid, fertile soils. People dug irrigation channels, shaped garden plots, and carefully tended these crops generation after generation. Unlike wheat or rice, these foods did not store easily. They had to be eaten fresh or cooked soon after harvest. But they offered reliability and abundance. Archaeologists in the Wagi Valley have uncovered traces of ancient ditches and garden systems, proof that these early highland farmers were engineers of the land. Their work shows us that the invention of agriculture was not confined to famous rivers or monumental cities. Even in the most remote corners of the world, people looked to the earth beneath their feet and transformed it into a source of life. This tradition would remain relatively isolated. Unlike maize or rice, New Guinea's crops did not spread widely beyond the island. Yet for the people who lived there, these gardens were the foundation of culture, of family, of survival. And they remind us of the diversity of human imagination in meeting the same universal need, the search for food. No matter where farming took root, the Middle East, China, the Americas, or New Guinea, people everywhere needed new tools to live this way of life. The Neolithic is remembered not just for its crops, but for the instruments that allowed those crops to flourish. The most iconic of these was the polished stone axe. Earlier, hunter-gatherers had used flint blades and hand axes, chipped roughly into shape. But Neolithic craftspeople took this to another level. They ground and polished their axes until the edges were razor sharp, the surfaces smooth, the weight perfectly balanced. With such tools, they could clear forests, fell trees, and shape wood for houses, boats, and fences. Grinding stones were equally essential. Across the world, flat slabs and handheld rubbers wore grooves into their surfaces as people ground grain, roots, and seeds into flour. The slow rhythm of grinding filled countless Neolithic houses, the music of survival, a patient sound of stone on stone. Pottery was another revolution. For the first time, people could cook by boiling, storing food safely for months, and carry water in durable vessels. Pottery took on styles unique to each culture: painted spirals of yangshao in China, impressed chords of jomon in Japan, bold linear bands of LBK in Europe. Every pot was both tool and art, blending necessity with beauty. And then came textiles. The earliest farmers did not only grow food, they also grew plants like flax, spun fibers into thread, and wove cloth. Textiles softened life, bringing warmth, protection, and decoration. They also became symbols of identity, woven patterns speaking of belonging to a family, a village, a people. Each of these tools, and the polished axe, the grinding stone, the pot, the woven cloth, may seem simple, but together they transformed human life. They turned forests into fields, seeds into meals, and shelters into homes. They made it possible not just to survive, but to build communities, traditions, and cultures that would last. At first glance, the invention of farming seems like an unquestionable triumph. Food could now be grown in abundance, stored for lean seasons, and relied upon year after year. Populations grew, villages expanded, and life appeared more secure than it had ever been for the hunters and gatherers who came before. And yet, the story is more complicated. Agriculture was not simply a gift, it was also a burden. For the first farmers, daily life became harder in many ways. Hunter-gatherers ate diets that were diverse and seasonal: berries, nuts, roots, fish, game, honey, fruits. They moved constantly, balancing their food sources with the land's natural rhythms. Their teeth were often healthier, their bones stronger, their bodies lean and well exercised. By contrast, the first farmers depended heavily on a small number of staple crops: wheat, barley, millet, rice, maize, potatoes. These foods provided calories, but not always balance. People began to suffer from nutritional deficiencies: lack of iron, lack of protein, lack of vitamins. Skeletons from early farming communities often show signs of anemia, stunted growth, and enamel defects on teeth from childhood stress. The very success of farming made people vulnerable. If a harvest failed, if a blight struck the crops, famine followed. Whole villages might face hunger. For all its promise of abundance, agriculture introduced a fragility that hunter-gatherers had never known. Another hidden cost of farming was disease. For the first time in history, humans and animals lived side by side in close quarters. In a Neolithic longhouse, cows, sheep, and goats might sleep only a wall away from their owners. Their breath mingled in the air, their waste collected near the hearth. Out of this closeness emerged new illnesses, infections that jumped from animals to people, diseases that spread easily in crowded conditions. Hunter-gatherer bands of 20 or 30 people could not sustain epidemics. Diseases burned out quickly. But in farming villages of hundreds or even thousands, contagion could spread and endure. Measles, smallpox, influenza. The seeds of future plagues were sown here in the warmth of Neolithic hearths. The most iconic of these was the polished stone axe. Earlier, hunter-gatherers had used flint blades and hand axes chipped roughly into shape. But Neolithic craftspeople took this to another level. They ground and polished their axes until the edges were razor sharp, the surfaces smooth, the weight perfectly balanced. With such tools, they could clear forests, fell trees, and shape wood for houses, boats, and fences. Grinding stones were equally essential. Across the world, flat slabs and hand-held rubbers wore grooves into their surfaces as people ground grain, roots, and seeds into flour. The slow rhythm of grinding filled countless Neolithic houses, the music of survival, a patient sound of stone on stone. Pottery was another revolution. For the first time, people could cook by boiling, storing food safely for months, and carry water in durable vessels. Pottery took on styles unique to each culture: painted spirals of Yangshao in China, impressed chords of Jomon in Japan, bold linear bands of LBK in Europe. Every pot was both tool and art, blending necessity with beauty. And then came textiles. The earliest farmers did not only grow food, they also grew plants like flax, spun fibers into thread, and wove cloth. Textiles softened life, bringing warmth, protection, and decoration. They also became symbols of identity, woven patterns speaking of belonging to a family, a village, a people. Each of these tools, known the polished axe, the grinding stone, the pot, the woven cloth, may seem simple, but together they transformed human life. They turned forests into fields, seeds into meals, and shelters into homes. They made it possible not just to survive, but to build communities, traditions, and cultures that would last. At first glance, the invention of farming seems like an unquestionable triumph. Food could now be grown in abundance, stored for lean seasons, and relied upon year after year. Populations grew, villages expanded, and life appeared more secure than it had ever been for the hunters and gatherers who came before, and yet the story is more complicated. Agriculture was not simply a gift, it was also a burden. For the first farmers, daily life became harder in many ways. Hunter-gatherers ate diets that were diverse and seasonal: berries, nuts, roots, fish, game, honey, fruits. They moved constantly, balancing their food sources with the land's natural rhythms. Their teeth were often healthier, their bones stronger, their bodies lean and well exercised. By contrast, the first farmers depended heavily on a small number of staple crops: wheat, barley, millet, rice, maize, potatoes. These foods provided calories, but not always balanced. People began to suffer from nutritional deficiencies: lack of iron, lack of protein, lack of vitamins. Skeletons from early farming communities often show signs of anemia, stunted growth, and enamel defects on teeth from childhood stress. The very success of farming made people vulnerable. If a harvest failed, if a blight struck the crops, famine followed. Whole villages might face hunger. For all its promise of abundance, agriculture introduced a fragility that hunter-gatherers had never known. Another hidden cost of farming was disease. For the first time in history, humans and animals lived side by side in close quarters. In a Neolithic longhouse, cows, sheep, and goats might sleep only a wall away from their owners. Their breath mingled in the air, their waste collected near the hearth. Out of this closeness emerged new illnesses, infections that jumped from animals to people, diseases that spread easily in crowded conditions. Hunter-gatherer bands of 20 or 30 people could not sustain epidemics. Diseases burned out quickly. But in farming villages of hundreds or even thousands, contagion could spread and endure. Measles, smallpox, influenza, the seeds of future plagues were sown here in the warmth of Neolithic hearths. And yet, despite these costs, farming allowed human numbers to swell. A field of wheat could feed far more mouths than a forest full of deer. With more food came more children. Villages grew into towns, towns into proto-cities. For the first time, population density became a force shaping history. But population growth brought new challenges. Land had to be divided and defended. Fields had to be expanded, sometimes at the cost of forests and wetlands. Neighbors competed for fertile soil and water. Conflict became more common as the security of farming was matched by the insecurity of defending it. Hunter-gatherer societies were often relatively egalitarian. When food was shared daily and possessions were few, hierarchy had little room to grow, but farming changed that balance. Stored grain could be hoarded. Herds could be counted and claimed. Some families accumulated more, while others had less. Archaeology shows the first signs of inequality in Neolithic graves. Some individuals were buried with fine ornaments, polished stone axes, beads of exotic shells. Others were laid to rest with little at all. Status was being born, the division of society into those who had and those who had not. The seeds of kings and peasants, lords and laborers were planted here in the furrows of the first fields. So the Neolithic Revolution was a paradox. It gave abundance, but also fragility. It allowed more people to live, but often in poorer health. It built community, but also hierarchy. It opened the door to civilization, and at the same time, it chained humanity to the endless cycle of sowing and reaping, planting and harvesting. And yet, despite the costs, there was no going back. Once people had tasted the security of harvest and the possibility of surplus, the old life of hunting and gathering slowly faded away. Humanity had stepped onto a path that would lead, in time, to cities, empires, and the modern world. For thousands of years, stone had been humanity's most faithful companion. Flint blades, obsidian knives, polished axes. These were the tools that carved forests, built homes, and prepared food. But somewhere in the Neolithic world, people began to notice something different. Now and then, they found unusual stones, greenish nuggets in riverbeds, bright metallic flecks in the soil. When struck, they shone. When hammered, they bent instead of breaking. These curious rocks were copper, and they would open the door to a new chapter of human history. At first, copper was rare and precious. People collected small nuggets from the earth and hammered them into beads, hooks, and simple tools. Unlike stone, which fractured, copper bent beneath the blows of a hammer. It was soft, easily reshaped, and it gleamed in the firelight. Imagine a Neolithic person wearing a necklace of bright copper beads. To the community, it must have seemed magical. A substance pulled from the earth that caught the sun and moon, shining with its own light. These ornaments became symbols of status, proof of connection to mysterious forces below the soil. The real revolution came later, when people discovered that copper could be smelted from ore. This was no small discovery. It required fire hot enough to transform rock into liquid metal. Perhaps it began accidentally. A campfire built on mineral-rich stones, the flames licking through, leaving behind beads of copper in the ashes. Someone noticed. Someone experimented. And slowly, the knowledge spread. Now, copper could be produced in larger quantities, shaped into blades, awls, chisels, and pins. It was still softer than flint, still less practical for heavy cutting, but it was workable, beautiful, and new. More importantly, it was the first step toward a greater discovery still to come. The rise of copper also reshaped society. To find and smelt it required specialized skills. Not everyone could recognize ore. Not everyone could master the fires. Metallurgy created a new class of specialists, early craftsmen who held secrets that others did not. Knowledge became power, and power began to concentrate in the hands of the few. At the same time, copper objects became signs of prestige. A polished stone axe was still the farmer's tool, but a copper ornament was something rarer, more symbolic. It marked the beginnings of wealth and distinction. Symbols carried not in food alone, but in metal. Copper, however, had its limits. Too soft for heavy work, it bent and dulled quickly. Yet through further experimentation, people learned to combine it with other minerals, especially tin, to create a stronger alloy, bronze. This would not happen everywhere at once. It would take centuries, even millennia, for bronze to spread across the world. But the path had begun. The first sparks of metallurgy glowed in the late Neolithic fires. What began as hammered beads would one day lead to bronze swords, iron plows, and the steel of skyscrapers. And it all started with those curious green stones shining in the dirt, whispering to humanity of a future forged in fire. The Neolithic was more than just another chapter in prehistory. It was the great hinge on which the door of human destiny turned. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors had lived as hunters and gatherers, moving with the seasons, carrying little more than what could be held on their backs. Then, within a few thousand years, the blink of an eye in evolutionary time, everything changed. People settled. They built homes from stone and clay. They planted seeds and waited for harvest. They stored grain in pits and pots. They raised animals not only to hunt, but to herd. With these choices came permanence. With permanence came memory. With memory came civilization. The gifts of farming are clear. More food meant more people could live. Villages grew into towns, towns into cities. Artisans, priests, and leaders emerged because not everyone had to work the fields. Specialization gave rise to new skills, new crafts, new knowledge. Pottery, weaving, metallurgy, and writing, all of these blossomed on the fertile ground that agriculture created. The Neolithic gave us time to dream, to paint on cave walls, to carve figurines, to build monuments aligned with the stars. It gave us community, ritual, tradition, and the beginnings of history itself. But farming carried its burdens too. Diets became less diverse. Bodies weakened under the strain of repetitive labor. Crowded villages became breeding grounds for disease. Famine and surplus alternated like the turning of the seasons. Inequality appeared as some stored more and others had less. Violence over land and resources grew sharper. The Neolithic was both gift and burden. It gave humanity abundance, but at a price. It gave stability, but also fragility. It made us more numerous, but often less healthy. It bound us to the soil, to cycles of sowing and reaping that would define our lives for millennia. And yet, for all the changes that followed, bronze, iron, empires, machines, we still live in the shadow of the Neolithic. The crops first planted then, wheat, rice, maize, potatoes, still feed the majority of humanity today. The animals first herded then, cows, sheep, goats, pigs, still shape our landscapes and diets. The habits first learned then, to settle, to store, to build, to divide, still shape our societies. We are, in a sense, still Neolithic people, only dressed in modern clothes, holding modern tools. Our skyscrapers rise where once rose megaliths. Our fields stretch wider, but they are still fields. Our lives are longer, but they are still bound by food, water, and the fragile balance with nature. So when you think of the Neolithic, think not only of stone axes and clay pots, but of the first whispers of everything we are today. Civilization did not begin with steel or with steam, but with seeds pressed into earth, with fires tended through long nights, with villages of stone and wood where people dreamed of tomorrow. The Neolithic was not the end of prehistory. It was the beginning of history itself, the dawn of the human story we are still writing. The sun rises slowly over a small, Neolithic village. Smoke curls from hearths, dew clings to the thatch of roofs, and the earth is cool beneath bare feet. Families stir from sleep on beds of straw and skins. Children rub their eyes, their hair tangled, as the first sounds of the day fill the air. The bleating of goats, the low call of cattle, the distant barking of a dog kept for watch and hunt. Morning begins with fire. Embers carefully banked overnight are coaxed back to life with dry grass and a steady breath. Soon, the smell of wood smoke spreads through the village. Someone grinds grain on a stone quern, the slow rhythmic sound of stone on stone marking the pulse of the day. Cakes of barley or millet are baked on flat stones near the fire, their scent mixing with the smoke. As the light strengthens, the fields call. Men and women walk out together, carrying wooden hoes, flint sickles, baskets woven of reeds. The land is still damp with morning mist. Some weed between young shoots of barley. Others repair low stone walls that keep animals from wandering. Children help by chasing birds from the crops, their shouts rising into the morning air. The work is slow and heavy. Soil clings to hands, sweat darkens tunics, backs ache from bending. Yet there is pride here too. Each seed a promise, each stalk of grain a future meal. Farming is labor, but it's also hope written into earth. At midday the sun grows fierce. Families return to shade, sitting beneath trees or the lean-to shelters at the edge of fields. Meals are simple, a pot of stew made from lentils and herbs, maybe a piece of dried meat, flatbread warm from the morning fire. Water is drawn from a well, cool and fresh. Children chase each other while elders rest, telling stories that drift like smoke in the hot, still air. Afternoons bring different tasks. Some stay behind to tend animals, milking goats or leading cattle to graze. Women sit together weaving cloth from flax or wool, their hands moving with practiced ease. Others shape clay into pots, their fingers smoothing the walls. The vessels left to dry in the sun before being fired. In one corner, a man chips at a block of flint, showering sparks of stone as he shapes a new blade. Nearby, another polishes an axe head, dipping it into water and grinding it against sandstone. The sound is sharp and steady, a reminder that tools are life. Without them, fields cannot be sown, trees cannot be cleared, food cannot be prepared. As the sun dips low, people return from the fields. Tools are stacked, baskets emptied, animals brought back to pens within the village. Fires are lit once more, and the smell of cooking fills the air. Stews bubble, meat roasts, bread bakes on the hearthstone. The village gathers. Laughter rises, stories are told, songs are sung. A child curls against a parent, listening not just to words but to rhythm, learning history through voice. The community is knit together in these moments, bound not just by survival but by shared memory. Darkness falls, the stars brighten overhead, and the Milky Way stretches like a river of light across the sky. People retreat indoors to low-roofed houses warm with fire. They lie down on straw beds, cloaked in skins, side by side with family. Dogs curl at their feet. Outside, the night hums with insects, the air cool and damp. Sleep comes slowly, accompanied by the crackle of embers and the steady breathing of kin. Another day is passed in the rhythm of earth and sky. Tomorrow, it will begin again. For the first farmers, the world was more than fields and houses. Every stone, every tree, every fire seemed alive with presence, the spirits of ancestors, the forces of nature, the mystery of the skies. All of these shaped their days as much as hunger and harvest. Death was not an ending, but a crossing. Graves from the Neolithic show us care, attention, and belief. People buried their dead with ornaments, beads, shells, polished stone tools, even pots filled with food. They laid bodies curled as if sleeping, sometimes painted with red ochre, a color that symbolized blood and rebirth. In some communities, the dead were buried beneath the floors of houses, as if the ancestors continued to dwell with the living. Each step on packed earth was also a step upon memory, a reminder that life and death were part of one unbroken circle. Across Europe and the Near East, entire landscapes were reshaped into monuments for the dead. Passage tombs like Newgrange in Ireland were built with stone corridors aligned to the rising sun. On the winter solstice, light pierces the darkness, illuminating carvings of spirals and zigzags cut into stone. These were not mere graves. They were cosmic markers, places where earth and sky met through human hands. Imagine standing in such a chamber 5,000 years ago. The air is cool and heavy. The stones rise around you, vast and immovable. Outside, the longest night of the year presses down, and then, just as the first light of dawn breaks, a golden beam enters the passage, striking the back wall. Shadows dance. The chamber glows. For the farmers who gathered there, it must have felt like proof that the sun would indeed return, that life would continue, that cycles were eternal. But ritual was not only for the great monuments. It lived in the smallest details of daily life. A figurine placed by the hearth, a carved symbol scratched into pottery, a handful of grain offered to the fire before cooking. These quiet acts gave meaning to ordinary survival. In villages, people gathered not just to eat or work, but to celebrate. Harvest festivals marked the turning of the year. Music and dance filled the air, feet striking packed earth in rhythm, voices rising with drums and flutes. These were moments of joy, of connection, of gratitude. The harvest was not only food, it was a gift from the unseen forces of nature, and always above them the sky stretched wide. The phases of the moon guided planting and harvest. The rising and setting of stars became markers of time. Farmers looked upward, reading the heavens as carefully as they read the soil. In constellations, they saw animals, ancestors, stories to explain the vastness of night. Stone circles, standing stones, and alignments suggest that the Neolithic world was deeply attuned to celestial rhythms. To farm was to trust not just the earth, but the sky. Every seed pressed into soil was also a prayer to the sun and the rain. For the first farmers, there was no sharp line between sacred and ordinary. The sacred lived in hearth and field, in stone and water, in life and death alike. To grind grain was a ritual. To light fire was a ritual. To bury the dead was a ritual. The world itself was a temple, and every day was spent walking its endless aisles. Their beliefs, carved in stone and remembered in soil, still whisper to us. They remind us that humanity has always sought meaning beyond survival, that even as we learned to farm and settle, we never stopped asking the oldest questions. Who are we? Where do we come from? What lies beyond? Before the Neolithic, the earth was shaped mainly by rivers, glaciers, winds, and forests. Human presence left only faint traces. But with farming came a profound change. People began to shape the land itself. Forests that had stood for thousands of years were cut down to make fields. Marshes were drained, stones cleared, streams diverted. For the first time, humanity was not just living in nature, it was remaking it. Imagine the sound of axes in a dense forest, the thud of polished stone striking wood, the crack as trees topple, the shouts of people working together. Open clearings spread where once stood endless canopies. Sunlight touched soil that had not seen the sky for ages. Into these new fields, seeds were pressed, and crops rose where once wild deer had grazed. Animals, too, became part of this transformation. The first farmers did not only hunt them, they began to tame them, to fold them into daily life. Dogs had long been companions, loyal in hunting and guarding, but now came others: goats, sheep, pigs, and cattle. Goats scrambled on rocky hillsides, their milk and meat feeding families. Sheep provided wool, soft and warm, spun into thread and woven into cloth. Pigs rooted in the earth, growing fat on scraps, turning waste into food. Cattle, strong and patient, became symbols of power. Their hides for leather, their strength for plowing, their milk for nourishment. To live among animals was to live with constant sound. The bleating of sheep, the lowing of cattle, the grunting of pigs, all blended with the voices of children and the crackle of fires. Villages were not quiet places. They were alive with the mingling of human and animal worlds. But this closeness had its costs. Living with animals meant living with their diseases. Germs leapt from cows to people, from pigs to children. Sickness spread more easily than ever before. Crowded houses and pens created new vulnerabilities, ones that hunter-gatherers had never faced. Yet people accepted this burden. The benefits outweighed the dangers. Animals brought food, clothing, transport, and status. They were wealth that could be counted, traded, and inherited. They were part of the household, part of the economy, part of the sacred. Everywhere farming spread, the earth changed. Forests shrank. Grasslands expanded. The air filled with smoke from burning fields. Wild animals retreated as herds grew. Archaeologists speak of the Neolithic footprint, a visible mark left on landscapes across the world. For the first time, humans became a geological force. Step by step, field by field, the balance of nature shifted. The relationship between people and the planet entered a new phase, one that continues to this day. And yet, for all this transformation, Neolithic people still lived close to the pulse of the natural world. They knew its rhythms intimately. They read the seasons in the budding of trees, the migration of birds, the rise and fall of rivers. They watched the sky for rain, for sun, for omens. They feared drought, flood, frost, and storm. Nature was both ally and threat, provider and destroyer. To honor it, they carved symbols of animals into stone, painted them onto pottery, and told stories around the fire. Bulls, deer, birds, and serpents, each carried meaning, each bound people to the wild forces that surrounded them. The Neolithic was not a single moment, but a long unfolding. As centuries passed, landscapes shifted. Forests gave way to villages, rivers to irrigation channels, wild herds to domesticated flocks. For those who lived it, these changes may have seemed slow, natural, even inevitable. But in truth, they marked the beginning of humanity's reshaping of the earth, a process still unfolding in our own time. A single family could not farm alone. Fields needed clearing, walls needed building, canals needed digging. The Neolithic village was not just a cluster of houses, it was a web of cooperation. Each person had a role, each task wove into the whole. Imagine the harvest. Men and women together cut grain with flint sickles, the dry stalks falling in rhythm. Children gathered the sheaves and carried them to baskets. Elders sat near the edge of the field, watching, giving advice, reminding the young of rituals to honor the spirits of fertility. Afterward, everyone returned together, carrying food into the village, singing to keep step. Such shared labor built trust. It created bonds stronger than blood, bonds of community, obligation, and shared memory. In these bonds, the first roots of society grew. But where there is cooperation, there is also conflict. Disagreements arose over land, over water, over animals that strayed into another family's plot. Voices were raised, tempers flared. Sometimes disputes were settled by elders, their words carrying the weight of years. Sometimes they ended in broken friendships, and sometimes they ended in violence. Beyond the village, tensions grew sharper still. As populations increased, neighboring communities pressed against one another. A fertile valley might be claimed by two groups. A herd might wander too far. A raid could bring animals or grain, but also vengeance. Archaeological sites tell these stories in silence. Fortified ditches, palisades of wood, and skeletons with arrowheads lodged in their bones, all evidence that the Neolithic was not always peaceful. Farming created abundance, but abundance was worth fighting for. As villages grew, they needed leaders, not kings, not yet, but respected figures who could mediate disputes, guide rituals, or organize labor. Perhaps it was the elder with the sharpest memory who remembered when the rains had failed. Perhaps it was the hunter with skill and courage. Perhaps it was the woman who held the secrets of healing herbs. Leadership in the Neolithic was fragile, based on persuasion, on trust, on ritual authority. Yet it marked the first steps toward hierarchy, toward organized governance. From such seeds, centuries later, kingdoms would grow. To hold communities together, ritual was essential. Feasts bound people in gratitude and joy. Shared ceremonies honored the dead, reminding the living of their place in a lineage. Stone monuments and shrines were built not only as offerings to the gods, but as anchors of identity, proof that this community had roots, that its memory would endure. Picture a feast after harvest. Fires blaze high, pots of stew bubble, music rises from bone flutes and drums. People dance in a circle, shadows flickering on stone walls. In the glow of the flames, differences fade. For one night, all belong to the same rhythm, the same song, the same earth. When we look back at these villages, their fields, their houses, their graves, we see more than survival. We see the outlines of society, cooperation and conflict, leadership and ritual, equality and inequality. These were the first experiments in living together on a scale larger than the family. The Neolithic village was a seedbed. From its soil would grow tribes, chiefdoms, cities, and empires. But even at the beginning, the essential questions of human life were already here. How do we share? How do we decide? How do we live together? And the answers, written in earth and stone, still echo in the ways we organize our communities today. Stone is heavy. It resists shaping, resists moving, resists every effort of human hands. To lift it is labor. To carve it is patience. To transport it is determination. And yet, in the Neolithic, people across Europe and beyond chose stone as their medium, not for houses, not for fields, but for monuments. Why? Because stone endured. While wood decays and clay crumbles, stone stands. To build in stone was to declare that memory itself must endure. These monuments were not for a single season or even a single lifetime. They were for generations yet unborn, for ancestors yet to come. Across the Atlantic coast of Europe, from Portugal to Brittany to the British Isles, a vast tradition of megaliths, great stones, arose. Some were tombs, others circles, others alignments stretching for miles. Each demanded planning, effort, and above all, cooperation. Imagine the scene. A community gathers to raise a single standing stone. Dozens of people haul ropes made of twisted fiber. Logs serve as rollers beneath the massive slab. Commands are shouted. Songs are sung to keep rhythm. Slowly, the stone tilts, rises, and finally thuds into place. The crowd cheers. A monument has been born. Among the most striking of these monuments were passage tombs, long corridors of stone leading into chambers deep within mounds of earth. New Grange in Ireland, Maeshowe in Orkney, Gavrinas in Brittany, all share the same vision: to create a house for the dead, a place where the living could enter darkness, stand among carvings, and meet the memory of ancestors. The walls of these tombs are covered in symbols: spirals, circles, zigzags, lozenges. Their meaning is lost to us, but their repetition suggests a sacred language, a code of stone. And on special days of the year, solstices, equinoxes, sunlight enters the passages, striking deep within. Life and death, light and darkness were joined in these silent ceremonies of earth and sky. Other monuments took different forms. Stone circles, like the Great Ring at Avebury or the Henge at Castlerig, gathered communities into open spaces. These were not tombs, but stages, places for ritual, for gathering, for marking the movements of the heavens. In their quiet geometry, people found order, connection, and belonging. To stand in a stone circle is to feel embraced by time. Each stone is a marker of labor, each gap a window on the horizon. When the sun rises or sets in alignment, when the moon hovers above, the message is clear. Humanity is part of a larger rhythm, and stone records it for all to see. For Neolithic people, these monuments were more than architecture. They were memory made visible. They held the bones of the dead, the stories of ancestors, the rhythms of the cosmos. They were places where communities became more than collections of families. They were places where the identity of a people was declared in stone. The cost of such monuments must have been immense. Days, weeks, even months of labor, time taken from fields and flocks. Food had to be stored, workers fed, tasks coordinated, yet communities chose to pay this cost. Why? Because monuments created unity. They gave meaning to toil. They offered proof that the community was strong enough to move mountains. Even now, thousands of years later, these stones remain. Wind and rain have worn them, but they stand. Tourists walk among them. Archaeologists study them. Storytellers imagine them. And always they remind us of the Neolithic ambition to remember, to carve memory into the earth itself. When you stand before such a stone, you do not just see rock. You see hands that hauled, voices that sang, eyes that watched as the monument rose. You see a people declaring, "We were here. We will not be forgotten." Life began early in the Neolithic. Infants were swaddled in soft skins, rocked near the fire, lulled to sleep by the sound of grinding stones and crackling wood. Mothers nursed them while tending to pots or weaving, their hands never still. Fathers carried them into fields where the rustling of crops and the calls of birds became part of their earliest memories. Children were not sheltered from work. By the age of 5 or 6, they fetched water from streams, collected firewood, or scattered grain for chickens and ducks. Their games often mirrored adult life. Tiny flint tools found at some sites suggest children practiced napping alongside their elders, shaping useless little blades as training. Play and learning were one. Imagine the laughter of children running between houses, chasing dogs, splashing in puddles. Life was harsh, but it was never without joy. Childhood was short, yet it carried the spark of renewal for every community. The family was the core of Neolithic life, but family meant more than parents and children. Grandparents, cousins, in-laws, all lived close, sometimes under one roof, sometimes in houses clustered side by side. Kinship wove a net of obligation and support. Land was tended together, meals shared, disputes solved within the circle of relatives. Marriage likely tied not just two people, but two families. A woman joining her husband's household brought new skills, new traditions, sometimes new land. Bonds of kinship spread outward, linking villages into networks of trust and alliance. These networks gave security in times of need, for labor during harvest, for defense during conflict, for comfort in grief. For adults, life was work. Fields demanded endless care, plowing, sowing, weeding, harvesting. Animals needed feeding, pens needed mending, tools needed sharpening. Women bore much of the double burden, tending children and fields alike, grinding grain for hours each day, weaving cloth, preparing food. Hands grew callous, backs bent from labor. Yet work also gave rhythm and meaning. The turning of seasons structured life, each task a thread in the tapestry of survival. Illness was common. Broken bones from accidents, tooth decay from grain-heavy diets, fevers and infections from living with animals. Without modern medicine, even small wounds could be deadly. Healers turned to plants, herbs, and ritual. Willow bark for pain, honey for wounds, smoke and chant for the unknown. Some burials show evidence of care, individuals with injuries who lived years beyond them, suggesting that families nursed their weak and their sick. Even in hardship, compassion endured. Few lived long by our standards. Many died in childhood, many more in early adulthood. But those who reached old age were treasured. Their memories of seasons past, of floods and famines, of rituals and stories, gave guidance to the living. Wrinkles, white hair, and frailty were marks of wisdom. Imagine an elder seated by the hearth. Children gathered close, telling stories of ancestors and spirits, of hunts and harvests long ago. The voice is slow, the hands tremble, but the memory is sharp. In that moment, the elder is a bridge between past and present, between the living and the dead. The Neolithic human experience was one of fragility and resilience. Childhood was brief, adulthood demanding, old age rare but revered. Life was woven of labor, kinship, and memory. Joy was found in play, in feasts, in shared songs. Grief was found in loss, in sickness, in hunger. Through it all, families endured, passing life from one generation to the next. It was in these simple, intimate rhythms, birth, work, sickness, death, memory, that the true story of the Neolithic was lived. Not in monuments or tools alone, but in the everyday courage of ordinary people. The Neolithic ended thousands of years ago, yet its shadow still stretches across our lives. The choices those first farmers made to settle, to plant, to raise animals, to build, shape the foundations of our world. Every meal we eat, every city we live in, every community we belong to is built upon the soil they first tilled. The Neolithic shows us that survival was never an individual achievement. Clearing forests, planting fields, building monuments, all of these required communities. Alone, A person could not lift a standing stone or 10 acres of barley, but together villages created abundance, security, and memory. Even now, our greatest achievements are collective. Roads, bridges, science, art, none exist without cooperation. The first farmers remind us that strength lies not in isolation, but in working side by side, sharing burdens and victories alike. Neolithic people live closer to the earth than we do. They read the weather in the clouds, the seasons in the stars, the fertility of soil and the color of leaves. They depended utterly on the cycles of rain and sun, and they respected their power. Today, though technology shields us, we still depend on those same cycles: climate, water, soil. They remain the bedrock of our survival. The Neolithic whispers a warning that when we break balance with nature, we risk everything. Their world teaches us humility before the forces that sustain life. In stone tombs, in pottery, in carved spirals, Neolithic people sought to remember. They did not want their lives to vanish like smoke. They wanted to pass meaning forward to children, to strangers, to the unborn. Memory was sacred. We too live by memory, in books, in monuments, in digital archives. But the Neolithic reminds us that memory is not just storage, it is connection. It binds the living to the dead, the present to the past. To remember is to honor, to belong, to continue. The Neolithic also teaches us that progress always carries a price. Farming fed more people, but weakened health. Villages gave security, but also disease. Surplus created culture, but also inequality. Every gain was paired with a burden. This is as true today as it was then. Our technologies, our cities, our comforts bring wonders, but also costs, environmental strain, social division, new vulnerabilities. The Neolithic story reminds us to weigh those costs, to ask whether our progress serves all or only a few. Finally, the Neolithic teaches us the quiet dignity of ordinary lives. Not every person was a builder of monuments or a maker of copper. Most were farmers, herders, weavers, potters, people who rose with the sun, worked the fields, raised children, told stories, and kept the fires burning. It is easy to remember kings and warriors, but it was the countless unnamed farmers who carried humanity forward. Their endurance, their patience, their resilience are the true foundations of history. So what does the Neolithic teach us? That humanity is both fragile and strong, that we depend on earth, sky, and one another, that memory matters, progress has costs, and ordinary lives are extraordinary in their endurance. When you sit down to eat bread, remember the first hands that ground grain between stones. When you wear cloth, remember the first fingers that twisted flax into thread. When you walk through a city, remember the first villages of mud and stone. We are modern, yet we are still Neolithic, bound by food, by family, by memory, by hope. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all is this: humanity survives not by force alone, but by care for one another, for the earth, for the unseen connections that bind us across centuries. And so, our long journey through the Neolithic comes to its close. We have walked among the first villages, felt the weight of stone monuments, listened to the laughter of children, and shared the burdens of farmers who carried humanity into a new age. If this story has brought you calm, or if it has helped you drift toward rest, let it stay with you. These quiet echoes of the past are not just history. They are reminders of what it means to be human, to endure, to remember, and to live together. If you wish to join us again, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. Each week, we bring new stories of the past, told in the same calm voice, meant for rest, reflection, and sleep. A simple like or a few words in the comments help these stories travel further, reaching others who might need them too. But for now, let your eyes close, let your breath slow, and let the story fade into dreams. Sleep well, traveler. Until the next journey, may your nights be peaceful and your mornings full of light.